Good morning and welcome. This is the presentation and talk for the Richard E. Snow Award winner for early contributions to psychological research and educational psychology. And I am here, my name is Tim Burton. I'm here to introduce this year's recipient. Normally, the chair of the awards committee introduces the recipient of the award, but this year Andy Elliott was the chair of the committee and he didn't make it to the conference. I think he's spending another year abroad. How he gets that in his contract. But when I was asked to introduce the recipient, I said, no, I don't really want to do that because the last time I introduced an award recipient, it went terribly. And then I said, who is it? Who gets the award this year? And I was told that Akane Zusho of Fordham University is the recipient of this year's award. And I said, oh, great. I know that person, and I like her work, and I'm happy to do it. So Akane is a graduate of the combined program in educational psychology at the University of Michigan, which is the same program that I went to. So, so we're representing well. She received her degree in 2003, and she does research on the intersection of culture, achievement motivation, and self-regulation. And those happen to be areas of interest of mine as well, so there's a lot of convergence. I'm very honored and excited to introduce her. I think in every young scholar's career, there's a point at which they publish the paper that is their statement paper. And in my reading of Akane's work over the years, the paper that was published in 2011 in Educational Psychologist was her statement paper, Culturalizing Achievement Goal Theory. And what I really found striking about that work was that there's often discussion in motivation research or research in general about, discussion isn't necessarily the right word, lamentation about how we ignore culture and cultural context when we're studying whatever the psychological construct is. And then it's dropped. And yeah, it would be nice if we could do that, but I'm not sure how to do that, so I won't. And what I think Akane did in her paper was to go beyond saying we need to do this, but to attach it to a particular theory of motivation, a very popular theory of motivation, and say, here's how achievement goal theorists are not paying attention to culture, and here's what they could do to incorporate culture in their research on achievement goals. I think is a major statement and a major contribution to the field. And that, I think, is a signature moment in the beginning of her career, and what's sure to be many other signature moments in her career. So let me introduce Akane Zusho. Come on up. This is the plaque. We have a photo moment first before you get to hear her talk. There you go.
Thank you.
Okay, so the title of my talk today is Culturalizing Achievement Motivation and Promoting Learning for All. So more than 10 years ago, Marty Mayer, who many of you know is a legendary leader in the field of achievement motivation, spoke of a new challenge facing schools, and that new challenge was that of increasing diversity. And recent statistics would seem to indicate that our schools are definitely becoming much more diverse. What you're seeing up here are U.S. Census Bureau statistics. On the left-hand side is the U.S. population broken down by ethnicity in 2012, and as you can just focus in on the red bar, that bar, or the arc, represents the proportion of the U.S. population who identify themselves as being non-Hispanic white, and it's about 63% in 2012. But by 2060, which is less than 50 years from now, that red bar is expected to decrease by 20 percentage points. So by 2060, what this means is that we'll actually all be ethnic minorities. There will be no ethnic majority group in the United States. So ethnically, obviously, if this is the trend, our schools are definitely going to become much more diverse. With ethnic diversity, oftentimes what accompanies it is linguistic diversity. And again, here too, we're seeing a growth in the number of English language learners in our schools. This graph shows data from 1997 to 2007, where we saw a 53% increase in the number of English language learners in our schools. So again, linguistically, we're seeing increased diversity. I think I'd be remiss if I just defined diversity in terms of culture and ethnicity, even though that's really what I'm going to be focusing on today. But I think it's also important to note that academic diversity, too, is also increasing, and our teachers are being challenged with this task of trying to meet the needs of more and more diverse learners in terms of academic abilities. This graph, if you just again focus on the red line, shows the percentage of students with learning disabilities that are currently being served in general education environments, and you'll see again an upward trend there too. So before I continue, I really want to emphasize that I really do think that these trends are actually a positive thing, because I strongly believe that diversity can enhance the learning experience. But it does raise an important question for our field and for us as educational psychologists in terms of whether or not we are actually doing enough to really fully understand how this increasing diversity is going to impact teaching and learning in the 21st century classroom. So with that, I'm going to turn to current trends in the field of ed psych. There's been a couple of content analyses done in our field that I'm going to talk about two. This particular one that you're seeing up here, it was published in 1984 in Journal of Ed Psych, and it did a content analysis of sort of the popular topics that educational psychologists in 79 to 80 were focusing in on. And at that time, you can sort of see the top five. Evaluation and measurement was number 1, affect motivation number 2, linguistic discourse number 3, cognition reasoning 4, school learning subjects number 5. What was interesting is when I looked at that list of about 16 or so categories, I couldn't really find a category that encompassed diversity, except for this category that kind of combined sex differences and race differences, and that was ranked at number 8, at least in 79 and 80. Oops, sorry, this way. In 2009, there was a broader analysis that was published in Ed Psych Review. This particular analysis looked at not only Journal of Ed Psych, but educational psychologists, Journal of Learning Sciences, Learning and Individual Differences, Contemporary Ed Psych, and Ed Psych Review. And starting with number 2, the ranking was learning and memory. Number 3 was affect and motivation. Number 4 was actually the same as 7980, cognition and reasoning. Number 5 was literacy. Does someone want to guess what number 1 was in 2009? It was classroom achievement. And there was a category of sociocultural factors, and that came in at a rank of 15. In 2009, there was about 25 or so categories. So what this tells me, and hopefully tells you, is that even though we're not completely ignoring issues of diversity, but it's still not our top priority, I don't think. So after reading this, I was kind of curious, and I wanted to see what actual percentage of publications, particularly focusing on educational psychologists and Journal of Ed Psych, so what percentage of those of articles published in those two journals really were devoted to issues of culture and ethnicity? And there's some error here, but I found in my analysis that within educational psychology, starting from the 1980s and onwards, and I started with 1980s in large part because that's when the field of psychology really showed a renewed interest in issues of culture, and we had cross-cultural psychology becoming more popular. But in educational psychologists, roughly 1 to 3% of the articles talk about issues of diversity. Within Journal of Ed Psych, it's similar. The 1990s, for whatever reason, was a pretty lean time, less than 1% to about 4%. So again, I think this also shows that we are not really, issues of culture and ethnicity are still not a primary issue in our field. As a motivational psychologist, though, there was a little bit of a silver lining. Of those studies that were published in Journal of Ed Psych, about a third of them actually also focus on issues of motivation. So for whatever reason, motivational psychologists are paying more attention to issues of diversity than other educational psychologists. So is the field of Ed Psych actually doing enough to understand issues of diversity? And based on this analysis, I would argue that no, in fact, we're probably not. So our schools are becoming much more diverse, and we're not really doing as many targeted studies looking at issues of diversity. So the next question you might actually have is, okay, if we are going to go about studying issues of cultural diversity, how should we go about doing that? So I've argued in the publication that Tim mentioned, and other people too have argued this, that we should take more of a universalistic approach to the study of culture or motivation. And what that means is that universalism is basically acknowledges that a lot of our experiences, our human experiences, are dependent upon cultural context. So we should see some differences in our human experiences based on culture. At the same time, though, universalism also recognizes that to the fact that we're all humans, there should be sort of a common bond that we share. And that as a result, we should be able to identify sort of those human universals. And so I'm particularly arguing today that universalism is probably the most appropriate approach to take, in large part because when I think about our schools, we want in our classrooms, we really want to be able to sort of facilitate the learning environments and create learning environments that work for everybody. So I'm going to return to that point at the end of my talk, but this is really why I'm pushing for universalistic approach to the study of culture, and in particular in terms of motivation. Absolutism is basically, I think, what most of the field of EdSpsych has would be characterized. We have come up with a lot of good theories, and for the most part, I do think that, at least in terms of motivation, those theoretical principles are universal. But we haven't really paid specific attention to how our theoretical frameworks do vary by cultural context. So in that sense, I think much of EdSpsych still tends to take an absolutist approach. Relativism, I think, shares a lot in common with universalism in the sense that it too emphasizes cultural context. But at the same time, what the primary difference is between relativism and universalism is relativism is not so much concerned with identifying those universals as perhaps universalism might be. I should also mention that relativism and universalism also share a common goal of developing culturally valid methodologies and trying to eradicate ethnocentric biases within the research. So that's what universalism is. So, okay, theoretically that's what universalism, but practically what does that mean? So in the next couple of minutes, I'm going to be talking about a couple of things that I think we can do as we can, sort of simple things that we can do as researchers to really promote more of a universalistic agenda. The first thing I think we can do is actually do more to explore within group differences, because a lot of the research on culture and motivation would really suggest that within group differences often exceed between group differences, and it's really important to sort of investigate what those are. So if you guys recall, this is the race question from the 2010 Census questionnaire. And if you just focus in on just the Asian categories here, you'll notice that the census actually has a fair number of checkboxes, and then it also allowed individuals to write in specific subgroup affiliations. So even though the census uses this broad category of Asian American and Pacific Islanders, it does recognize that Asian Americans are a pretty diverse group in and of themselves. There's about like 20 or so subcategories of Asian Americans. And same thing on the Pacific Islander side. It does recognize that Pacific Islanders are also a diverse group, representing people from Polynesia, obviously where we are today, Micronesia and Melanesia. So why do I bring this up? The reason why I bring this up is because there was a recent ETS report looking at the educational attainment of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And what that report highlights is the fact that there is great variation in the educational attainment rates of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. I really have to, I don't actually see him, but I have to thank Paul Schultz for alerting me to this report. So first on the Asian American side, the blue lines actually represent the percentage of students who don't actually finish high school, so who have less than a high school degree. And the red bars represent those students who actually go on and obtain a bachelor's degree or higher. So if you focus in on the longest red bars, you'll notice that they belong to Taiwanese Americans and Indian Americans. But if you focus in on the longest blue bars, you'll notice that those belong to the Cambodians and the Hmongs, which essentially means that there's great variations in terms of whether or not so even though we often lump Asians together, we do see great disparity in terms of educational attainment rates on the Asian American side. Same thing with Pacific Islanders. The report's actually quite interesting. It does spotlight Pacific Islanders, in large part because there is a troubling trend. If you focus on the bottom two bars, those are the aggregate data of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders as a group. And what that shows is that approximately of those students that do graduate high school, 87% of them actually do go on to some level of college. And about 73% actually obtain a college degree. But that's the group as a whole, right? And so if you just focus on that, you might argue, or you might conclude that Asian Americans in fact are a model minority. But if you look at the disaggregated data, focusing specifically on Native Hawaiians and Guamanians, you'll notice that the picture is very different. Only about 60% of students from Hawaii and Guam actually go on to college, and only about a quarter of them obtain a college degree. So obviously, aggregating data like this does mask the challenges of that Pacific Islander students are facing. The report also highlights that this attainment gap, I guess, is probably going to increase over time because the educational attainment rates of the younger generations of Pacific Islander students are actually lower than the older generation. So again, it's disturbing to me and hopefully to you in terms of the educational attainment rates of the students from this particular area. So again, the first thing that I think the universalistic approach would do is to really explore what those within group differences are, and to really think twice about who we're aggregating together. And the second thing I want to talk about is kind of goes along with the first point that I made. And as much as it's easy to do so, I think some of our statistical tools kind of promote this notion of categorizing people into groups and looking at group differences, and oftentimes we do that based on ethnicity or race. But I would urge everybody that we probably need to go beyond that, and we really need to sort of try to understand what the underlying mechanisms are that perhaps are associated with ethnicity or race that are really driving those differences. So I'm going to give you two examples of ways that we can actually go beyond ethnicity or race in our research. The first one, I think, is common to many of you. A lot of people who are interested in issues of culture have started to look at ethnic identity as a variable in their research. And essentially, this body of work recognizes that even though we might check off a particular box on the U.S. Census questionnaire, there's great variability in terms of how individuals identify with their heritage culture. In this particular example, it's pretty non-scientific, but I wanted to bring my family in a little bit. So my sister, who's sitting right here, she's always teased me that I am less Japanese than she is. We were both born in Japan, but I came here when I was 3.5, and she came here when she was 3 months old, but she also went back to Japan for high school, and then after she graduated from college too. So she spent more years in Japan than I've ever had. But I wanted to see whether or not our ethnic identity actually varied. So I had her fill out the multi-group ethnic identity just to see whether or not her claims were in fact right. Obviously not very scientific, but I had a rating of about 3 on a 5-point scale, and my sister had a rating about 4. So perhaps there's some validation to her point. But the point I'm trying to make here is that even within our family, we see great disparity in terms of ethnic identity. If you look at the research that's out there on ethnic identity too, you'll also see great variations. And the research also generally shows that those students with higher levels of ethnic identity actually do better in school. So ethnic identity, I think, is one way in which we could go beyond ethnicity. The second way, at least or the variable that I've considered in my own research, and a lot of this is because I focus a lot on Asian American students. But what I've looked at is this distinction between an independent view of self versus an interdependent view of self. Most of this comes from the social psychological literature. And what that literature basically suggests is that in independent cultures, such as the US, we're more likely to adopt an independent view of self, where we sort of think of ourselves as being separate from others. Influence, perhaps, definitely, but more like a bounded entity. And as a result, those individuals who tend to have a dominant independent view of self are more likely to want to be in control and separate from others, focus on promotion, and generally show self-enhancement tendencies. By contrast, those individuals who adopt an interdependent view of self, such as individuals who in collectivistic cultures, for example Japan, define the self more in line. So the boundary between oneself and others, especially significant others, is more porous, and that you might actually define your identity in line with those significant others. As a result of an interdependent view of self, some of the psychological tendencies are to be responsive to others, focus on the prevention of failure, and generally being more focused on self-criticism. So because you're sensitive to negative attributes that you think you can improve. So I thought, well, okay, I'm conducting studies looking at Asian Americans and Anglo-Americans, so perhaps I really should consider this. But I also thought, well, Americans aren't always independent, right? And Asians probably aren't always interdependent. I also was interested in whether or not you could sort of situationally prime these views of self so that you can make Anglo-Americans think more like Asians and vice versa. And this line of reasoning, again, came from social psychology because people who focus on views of self often talk about that within us, no matter what our ethnic background, we have an individual self, and we have more of a relational and collective selves as well. This kind of assumption is also inherent in a lot of our motivational research too. If you consider self-determination theory, self-determination theory, there's a need for autonomy, confidence, and belonging. There's also research on bicultural students, so students who identify with more than one culture, and that research also shows that you can prime different views of self based on what you make salient to bicultural students. So based on this, I was interested in whether or not I could actually prime views of self. And the way I went about doing that is I just had participants, and again, these were Anglo-American and Asian American participants, and Asian American participants were primarily of East Asian descent. They just read this scenario. I asked them to imagine themselves as being a warrior, and you were largely responsible for conquering Mesopotamia, or helping to conquer Mesopotamia. And as a result of your efforts, you were rewarded by Sargon I or I, depending on how you read it, with a small kingdom. And about 10 years later, Sargon contacts you again and says there's going to be a new war. You need to send a detachment of soldiers, and you also need to decide who to put in command of that detachment. And the scenario says that you decide on Tiglath. At this point, the prime diverges depending on the independent versus interdependent. The independent prime, states that you decide on Tiglath because Tiglath was a talented general. By choosing Tiglath, it would make him or her indebted to you. It would solidify your hold on your own dominion. It would also increase your prestige. The interdependent prime basically said that you chose Tiglath because Tiglath was a member of your family, and by doing so, you can show loyalty to your family. It would also ultimately increase the power and prestige of your family, and you would make Sargon indebted not to you, but to your family. So you could sort of see the focus on the family with the interdependent prime. And just based on sort of something as simple as this, I was actually able to find, and this is based on my dissertation research, that individuals who received the independent prime rated themselves higher, albeit it wasn't a huge effect, but they did rate themselves higher on an independent self-control scale. So we found that. I also found that individuals who were primed with the independent prime were also more likely to show self-enhancement tendencies than individuals who were who received the interdependent prime. And I should mention that I actually did not find any ethnicity effects, so no, but I did find priming effects. So in particular with this, I found that those who received the independent prime were more likely to rate themselves higher on self-discipline, initiative, and the extent to which they were hardworking. I should also mention that no matter what prime they received, the participants in my sample actually did show tendencies towards self-enhancement, given that 50% and higher were considered to be self-enhancement. But in general, those students who received the independent prime had higher ratings than those who did not. In another study, I also found that priming effects on academic achievement outcomes, math achievement to be precise. Again here, those students who received the independent prime actually answered more questions correct on a math exam, and they were also more likely to attempt more questions. So I did see priming effects on achievement as well. So going back to my point, I think we really need to go beyond issues of ethnicity and race. I gave you 2 examples of how perhaps we can go about doing that. The third thing that I think we really need to do is I think we really need to improve and expand our methodologies. This probably should really be number 1. So one of the things I think we really need to ask ourselves is whether or not our current existing measures are in fact culturally valid. With one exception, just focusing on popular measures in the field of achievement, motivation, and affect. And if you trace back the history of these instruments, you'll find that for the most part, and again with one exception, they were developed primarily for American students and primarily for American white students. Whether it's the PALS, the AGQR, the MSLQ, AEQ perceptions of parent scale, the loan or the instrument that I think is very different in terms of how it was developed and validated was that of the instrument of school motivation. I see Dennis back there, who could probably speak more about that. But that the ISM was developed actually so that it was culturally valid for use with multiple groups, including Australian Anglos, immigrant and indigenous student populations. And I'm not trying to say that these measures that we're using are not culturally valid, but one of the things I think we really need to think about, especially if we're going to be using these measures, is to what extent they are in fact valid for the population that you're studying. For example, one of my former students for his dissertation, he really wanted to look at issues of autonomy support. And so he came across the perceptions of parent scale and teacher scale, and he decided to use that. And we found that it actually did not work very well in this population of Caribbean immigrant students, predominantly Caribbean, also Latinos. So again, I think this kind of shows you that we shouldn't go about assuming that our measures are in fact always valid for use with different populations, especially populations where the instrument has not been normed on. So what else can we do? I think what we really need to do is to consider qualitative methodology in our research, particularly when we're trying to understand cultural processes. And that's exactly what one of my students actually did. Again, this is based on her dissertation study. She really was interested in seeing whether or not our motivational frameworks were applicable to Jamaican students. She herself is Jamaican, and she really didn't want to administer a battery of pre-existing measures because she wanted to hear from their own mouth how they defined motivation without sort of putting researchers' words into their mouths. And what she actually found was that through this qualitative analysis, she was able to identify both commonalities, so things that Jamaicans definitely had in common with the overarching literature on motivation, as well as sort of specific differences. So when she asked them how motivation was, what did it mean to them, she found that their responses really could be categorized in terms of personal as well as contextual factors. And if you read the literature on motivation, a lot of our frameworks do adopt that kind of person by context focus. So she found that Jamaican students were also more likely to define motivation in terms of internal factors as well as external factors or contextual supports for motivation. What she also found was processes or things that were unique to that particular population. There was a recurring theme of the importance of religion in fostering Jamaican students' motivation to achieve. And she also found that Jamaica's history of slavery was talked about a lot by participants. They often referred to Marcus Garvey as sort of being an inspirational figure. So, again, I think qualitative methods could be useful in not only, in allowing us to sort of understand more deeply how culture is impacting them, and also to identify sort of the universals as well as differences. So, just to summarize, in terms of universalism, the first thing I think that we can do, like I said before, is explore within group differences, go beyond ethnicity or race, and improve and expand our methodologies. So in the remaining time that I have, I wanted to kind of go back to the classroom and then also to give you a little bit of a preview of sort of the current projects that I'm working on. You could all say that universalism is all well and good, but what are we actually doing in the classroom to help these students? And Marty Mayer, who was also one of my advisors, he talked about ways in which you could deal with diversity in the classroom. And he said that you could deal with diversity by developing specialized programs for individual groups, or you could deal with diversity by trying to find what would be, in his words, optimal learning environments that have basic universal value. And you could argue, okay, or we can ask, well, what is that? What does a classroom with basic universal value look like? And I'm going to bring Dennis back into my presentation again. In his research, he often talks about how an emphasis on mastery goals may in fact be the most culturally appropriate. And in my research too, I'm also finding that no matter what the background, whether I focus on again Asian American students, Latino students, African American students in my research, and I generally find this trend where mastery goals, the endorsement of mastery goals, so goals focused on learning and understanding, are related to the most adaptive motivational beliefs and learning profiles. So in particular, I'm finding that mastery goals are positively related to self-efficacy and perceptions of competence. I also find that adoption of goals, mastery goals in particular, are related to deeper processing study strategies, help seeking. It's also, again, I know there's some controversy about the link between mastery goals and achievement, but my research on sort of an ethnically diverse high school population, we do see strong around point 2 relations between mastery goals and academic achievement. So based on this, I really think that trying to create a mastery-oriented environment would be the environment that has basic universal value. Currently, I'm trying to also conduct studies looking to see whether or not mastery goals are less likely to promote stereotype threat. So what I've done recently is collaborate with Rhonda Bondi, who has long history in schools, and what we're trying to do is develop a professional development program for educators. And we're calling this All Ed, standing for All Learners Learning Every Day. And essentially what this web-based PD program is intended to do is to help teachers increase their skills to differentiate instruction so that all students, no matter what their background, what their needs are learning every day. And in particular, what we're focusing in on these, what we're calling 4 essential routines. We're making sure that teachers have the skills to be able to implement and understand formative assessment. We're also focusing on issues of collaboration, making sure that the teachers understand what tasks are in fact group worthy, because not all tasks require groups, and also making sure that when they are working in groups that they know what to do. We're also looking at we're exploring the role of supporting autonomy support in more of a structured way, and obviously self-regulation. We feel that some students do need more help from teachers, and teachers have to give that if the kids don't know how to function independently. So we do place a lot of emphasis on promoting self-regulation. And what we're finding in sort of our preliminary analyses, looking at sort of teacher candidates that have gone through this PD program, is that students who, or candidates who, in terms of the beginning and end of a semester, we see increases in efficacy to differentiate instruction. We also see increases in mastery-oriented instructional practices as based on this framework that we're developing. In the fall, so in a couple of weeks, we're actually expanding this to work with New York City Public Schools. So we're going to be working with a cohort of teachers using all-ed as their PD framework. So that's where, so hopefully in conferences to come, we'll be able to give you more data on how that's going. Also, we're collaborating cross-culturally and using all-ed with a school, I believe, in Brazil and also in China as well. So we're also trying to look to see whether or not this framework actually works cross-culturally. So I think it would be appropriate to conclude this talk with this quote from Frank Pahars. In one of his last publications, he stated that as the world shrinks and as cultural diversity increases, attempting to understand how cultural variations influence academic motivation seems more critical than ever. And I hope I've done Frank some justice today in reminding us of the importance of studying culture and hopefully giving you some practical tips on how to do so that we can all culturalize educational psychology. So with that, I just wanted to thank Division 15 for this great honor. I also wanted to thank my former program, CPEP, in particular Stuart Karabanek for nominating me for this award. And over many years, I've had the great fortune of being able to collaborate with wonderful people and students. And I wanted to take a moment to thank them for supporting me professionally and also pushing my thinking about culture and motivation. And thanks also to my family for being here today and always